it is I, the Gruesome Ghoul, here with another strange story from Halloween Horrors, edited by Alan Ryan, a short story anthology of the creepiest time of year. Tonight's tingling tale is Trickster by Steve Rasnic Tem.
Or something to eat, let us repeat. Trick or treat. We've walked and walked the livelong day. We've knocked on many doors. Behind each door another face, and now we've come to yours. Trick or treat, trick or treat. We're children who live just down the street. Give us something to spend or something to eat. Let us repeat. Trick or treat. The day is turning into night, and shadows now appear. What once we sang so loud and bold, we mumble now with fear. Trick or treat, trick or treat. We're children who live just down the street. Give us something to spend or something to eat. Let us repeat. Trick or treat.
Introduction. Trickster by Steve Rasnic Tem. Steve Rasnic Tem sold his first short story to Ramsey Campbell's New Terrors. Since then, he has won a reputation as one of the finest new writers of short stories in the field. The first significant display of his work was in my own anthology, Night Visions 1, which contained 7 original stories. A few years ago, Tim, like most other writers in the field of horror, attended the World Fantasy Convention over Halloween weekend in Berkeley, California. One night, he left the hotel and went out to explore San Francisco. A writer like Tim tends to see things that other people don't see. Sometimes he even sees things that are almost not there. Trickster by Stephen Rasnic Tem. The giant green lizard with the hideous yellow tongue lapped greedily at our Volkswagen windshield. Marcy shouted and covered her face, her hand hitting the horn as she jumped. Then she looked up again, laughing nervously. "That's quite a costume," she said. I agreed. The crowd of Halloween revelers on Fisherman's Wharf walked around our car laughing, pointing, some of them grabbing the lizard's tail and giving it a shake. The lizard thrashed its head and roared. "How do you think he does that trick with the tongue?" Marcy asked. "It looks so real." "I don't know. He's pretty good. Almost as good as my brother was." The man in the lizard costume was staring at me through the eye holes. I could almost feel his gaze. Pressing closer to the windshield, I looked into his eyes, and I swear to you, they were my brother's eyes. My dead brother's eyes. I shouted something, and the lizard leaped off the hood of our car and strolled casually into the crowd. I opened the door quickly and ran after him. I heard Marcy yelling, but I ignored her. I was close now. I wouldn't let him get away. Halloween, the great witch night, was a favorite holiday for my brother Alex and me, although for different reasons. For me, it was a somber time, a day and a night to dwell on those people I'd known who had died. I believed that in some way they would come back, and not necessarily as ordinary ghosts. Maybe as a shadow, a phrase in a letter that strikes you oddly, an old toy. But I was always the serious one, the thinker, never more than half child. My brother was the joker. Halloween for him was an excuse for the most outrageous kinds of macabre jokes and theatrics. Bright red hair, luminous gray eyes, that grin. Our mother used to say he was purely half devil. For me, the spirits always seemed closer on Halloween night. For him, the souls of the dead were actually walking. He'd been gone a year. A year ago, someone crushed his skull with a pipe. It happened in a side street in the Castro, gay turf in San Francisco. About 3 a.m, the investigating officer said the killer or killers had worked on him until the clown mask he'd been wearing became virtually a part of his face. At first, the cops thought he just passed out drunk until one of them bent down and touched what they thought was part of the glistening clown paint. My brother loved being a clown. At first, I didn't believe he was really dead. Why should I? I mean, it wasn't the first time. 3 years ago, I found him in a bathtub in his apartment, a smoke-blackened heater in the water with him, his face pale, beginning to turn blue. I squeezed back into the corner behind the sink, too terrified to touch him. Then he calmly stood up in the water and asked me for a towel. He'd always been a trickster, even as a child. Not content to be a mere practical joker, he played with death. It started with snakes and spiders, the usual thing, dropping them down girls' dresses and laughing when the girls went squealing to the teacher. But after a time, he began adding a trick or two of his own, eating the spiders while the girl withered before him, carrying dead lizards around in his pockets for days in the hot summers. He was fascinated by such things, and even more fascinated by people's reactions to them. I remember once when the family was on a picnic, having a good time. We heard him screaming and looked up just in time to see him toppling off the edge of the Powell River Bridge. I thought our mother was going to die of fright. We ran over and found him hanging on a cable under the bridge, laughing at us. Another time he built an electric chair. It was an old barber's chair I'd helped him haul from the dump. He rigged it up with all sorts of fake electrical gear, glass insulators, and broken meters and the like. Then he turned a steel bowl into a helmet and asked me to wear it while he snapped a picture. He strapped me into the chair with some old belts to make it look more authentic, he said. After I was in place, he suddenly pulled out a live wire from behind the chair and moved to insert it into a clip he had attached to the top of the steel helmet. I squirmed and screamed, almost hysterical. I really believed he was going to do it. He had maneuvered behind me. I couldn't see what he was doing. And then he came around in front of me with the wire again and slid it into the clip. Nothing. He had switched the wires. He held up the severed end of the wire he'd inserted into my helmet and grinned. He didn't laugh, didn't even giggle. He just grinned. I'll never forget it. One tooth missing and his eyes crinkling like those of some demented fairy. Finally, when he was 14, Alex went too far. One of my mother's cousins, her husband, and new baby came to visit. We knew about a week ahead of time, and Alex spent most of that week complaining about how he didn't want to see them and that he hated babies. He said that if they came, something terrible would happen, said it in a threatening tone. That got him sent to his room. He obviously didn't mind. He had work to do there. When her cousin's family arrived, Mother just couldn't stop fussing over the baby, how cute it was, how contented it looked. Alex sulked and made several rude remarks that almost got him sent to his room again, but he knew just when to stop. They left the baby in the spare bedroom for a nap, and the rest of us gathered for dinner, except Alex. Mother called and called, but he didn't answer. Dad looked as if he were ready to strangle him if he ever showed up. Then we heard the baby crying. Dad took one look at my mother and bolted from his chair. The rest of us followed. When we got to the bedroom door, it was locked. We could all hear my brother laughing on the other side of the door. I'd never seen such fear on my father's face. He made me afraid, too. For the first time, I realized he didn't really trust my brother. He really thought Alex was capable of anything. It was the baby's father who broke the door down. We crowded through the doorway. Alex was there by the bassinet, grinning that weird grin of his. He was holding a knife. There was blood on it. Mom's cousin ran to the bassinet and screamed. I could see it from where I was standing. There was blood all over the blanket. Her husband was the first to move. He leaped across the room, and before anyone knew it, had my brother on the floor punching the daylights out of him. Dad and I tried to pull him off, but he wouldn't let Alex go until my brother's face was covered with blood. He still has, or had, a couple of scars and a slightly lopsided nose as a reminder of that day. It was another joke, of course. Dad picked up the doll Alex had painted so gorily and flung it on the floor. I stared at that doll for a long time. I was amazed. My brother had done a wonderful job. It looked so real. In an odd way, I found myself envying him. They did send my brother away that time, for a month. He wasn't much different when he got back. I couldn't run through the crowd of costume figures. The sidewalks were packed. It was like wading through the images in some overcrowded dream brought on by too much drugs and alcohol. Demons and fairies and cowboys and giant bumblebees, talking pumpkins, and Mr. Peanut, 3 Mr. Peanuts actually, maneuvering away from each other angrily. We can't all be originals, I suppose. I couldn't find the green lizard anywhere. I ducked into Ripley's Believe It or Not. It was a hunch, but not a far-fetched one. My brother had loved that sort of thing. Oddities, deformities. I could hear Marcy's voice somewhere behind me, but I couldn't stop. There weren't too many people in there. I guess there were enough oddities out on the sidewalk for them. I saw it almost immediately. It was as if I'd been drawn to it. The doll my brother had made in his 14th year, good as new, the fake blood glistening wetly beneath the bright lights. I had to stick my fingers in it. I couldn't help it. No, not quite the same. This time, the blood was real. I never really understood why I bothered with him, why I was so obsessed with him. I was always pulling him out of scrapes, bailing him out of jail, making excuses for him to my parents, friends, everyone. Not that he cared for me. I don't remember him ever showing the slightest signs of affection despite all that I'd done for him. One of his jokes cost me a job. He had drugged me and driven me to work at the chemical plant, acting hysterical and telling my boss that the poisons we were making had finally gotten to me, and how he was going to make sure the plant was closed down. I can imagine the scene. All those men I worked with trying to get my dead body away from my crazed brother, and him finally pulling a loaded gun to hold them off. They never believed I had nothing to do with it. But I still thrilled to his audacious exploits. I was the dull one, the careful one, the easily embarrassed. I had trouble speaking my mind about most things. I was afraid to do anything out of the ordinary. He could act out things I could only feel, and secretly I cheered him on. "Come on now, you hate it when Dad drags us hunting." Alex grinned his grin. Like a mask, it prevented you from seeing what he was really feeling. I know, but you can't do this. "Oh, just watch me, brother." He took the liver and raw meat scraps and laid them out carefully on our sleeping dog. He had sworn that the stuff he'd given Buck wouldn't hurt him, just make him sleep, and the old dog did seem to be breathing regularly, but you had to look close. From the doorway, he looked dead, and with all the blood and raw meat, torn up something awful. It was true. I didn't like going hunting with Dad. He'd shoot every game animal in sight and throw away more than half of everything he killed. None of us enjoyed eating squirrel, dove, or deer, not even him. He just liked the shooting. Once, he'd made fun of me for refusing to shoot a bird, said I was growing up too slow, that hunting was a great way to build character, and that I was missing a golden opportunity. Then he laughed at the way I looked when he put the rifle in my hands. That was the only time I remember ever actually hating my father. I thought about that as I laid his hunting rifle down by our dog. My father loved that dog. We waited behind the garage. I remember my brother grinning, a skull grin, a rictus as my father's car pulled up to the garage, my father screaming, my brother grinning, and my own quiet satisfaction. I ran outside into a virtual wall of people in animal masks, monkeys and bats, parrots and cats and dogs, the hideous face of a deranged rhino. The people wore evening dress with their masks, which made their grotesque heads even more hideous. I thought about Samhain, Lord of the Dead, and druids sacrificing animals before him. For a crazy moment, I thought there might be truth in that old story, that if I ripped the animal masks from these people's faces, I would find the same animal face beneath. They were the dead, walking among us, doomed to walk the earth in animal form until midnight tomorrow night, when Lord Samhain would harvest them with one great sweep of his gigantic, terrible scythe. I could hear someone laughing in their midst. Alex's laugh. A glimpse of a wide, luminous grin, one tooth missing. I twisted away from the crowd, ran into the street to avoid them. I couldn't bear the thought of touching even their fancy clothes. A car stopped with a screech behind me. I turned and stared at the windshield, then down on my knees, inches from the bumper. I thought I was going to cry, until Marcy jumped out from the driver's side, grabbed me, and pushed me into the car. She was quiet for a long time. She was always patient with me. She was patient now, but she was angry. She tossed her head irritably, and the shadows of black hair flowed and then settled down around her shoulders. "Want to tell me about it?" she asked quietly. "Alex! It was Alex in the lizard suit." She didn't sigh. She held on to it. I really wish you wouldn't do this to yourself. I know it's hard, but this is going to drive both of us crazy." Then, "Your brother's dead, Greg." "I know he is," I said immediately, not even thinking about it. Then I thought about it, and I was convinced he was dead, but maybe he was waiting around now after death, waiting to be harvested. I didn't see my brother much after high school. Occasionally there'd be an odd letter or a strange picture or cryptic message in the mail, sent anonymously like some communication from the dark side of myself. But I always knew who sent the things. Who else would do something like that? Once it was a picture of a woman working in a bomb factory. He had pasted a cartoon balloon next to her mouth saying, "I eat my dead children." Another time it was a shrunken head. I was afraid to get it authenticated. I do know he dropped out or was kicked out of several colleges for his usual range of pranks. I know he got one Midwestern fraternity shut down and forever banned because of his term as pledge master. Then there was the letter to my parents, a sincere letter on the surface confessing that he was gay. I didn't care, but of course my parents did. I've always wondered how much truth was in that letter. I suppose his usual haunts in the Bay Area would confirm the story, but it would be hard to tell with Alex. I suspect he was bisexual, considering his penchant for experimentation. Or maybe asexual. It's hard to imagine him loving or even lusting after anything more than he loved the dark and death. It saddened me that I knew so little about my brother. A few times as adults, we did run into one another. One of the times was just after I'd married Marcy, and although we had sent him an invitation to the wedding, it had been returned marked addressee unknown. We had just come back from a party in Berkeley. I walked into our bedroom, a little drunk, disoriented, and saw that there was a light on in the bathroom. I distinctly remembered turning that light out when we left the house. I stumbled in that general direction, and suddenly there was a deafening explosion at the back of my head, and I fell unconscious. It could be my imagination, but I have the distinct impression I saw my brother's face as I went down, narrow and skeletal, grinning. Marcy told me later that when she went into the room, she was struck by this awful smell, as if an animal had died in our bedroom. Then a soft voice, she thought it was my voice, said, "Come to bed. I need you, Marcy." She walked over and switched on the bed table lamp, and there I was lying on top of the covers, obviously dead, my skin peeling, my body reeking of corruption. She screamed and the lights went out. It was Alex, of course. When I came to, he was still in makeup, for my benefit, I suppose. His skills had definitely improved since our teen years. He looked just like me, identical to me, only dead. My stomach turned. "Just thought I'd congratulate you and the missus, brother." That was all he had to say. Marcy started screaming at him. "Get out! Get out! What kind of sick thing are you anyway? Why don't you crawl back into your slimy grave and leave normal people alone? Is this why you did this to us? Is this the only way you can get close to people?" Then something odd happened. My brother stripped off his makeup and just stared at her. I'd never seen such hatred, such revulsion in his face before. His face took on almost an animal aspect, a wolf or a coyote, but then it changed into something else. Loss or disappointment, I don't know, but he suddenly seemed such an outsider, something so alien that my heart went out to him for an instant as it never had before. He got up and walked silently out of the house, wraith-like, We didn't even hear the outer door open and close. It was as if he had never been there. Marcy drove me away from Fisherman's Wharf, fighting her way through the goblins and witches, the bees and frogs that had gathered around us up to the Cliff House restaurant overlooking the ocean. I discovered that I couldn't quite look at her, and instead kept turning to look out at the waves pummeling the rocky island a short distance offshore, and back to the other tables, bowls of apples and nuts, a man in a cockroach suit, a woman wearing sequins glued to her cheeks and elaborate spirograph patterns, and a man in a clown mask who seemed to be by himself staring at me. The mask had blue gauze pasted over the eye holes so he could see me, but I couldn't see his eyes, just two blue ovals. I couldn't take my eyes away from him the second time I looked his way. No one was serving him. It was as if no one else saw him. Then Marcy touched my arm. "Talk to me," she said. "He's still alive." It was all I could say. The man in the clown mask still stared at me. Under the dim light in the corner, he looked like an old photograph, yellowed and cracking, the surface of the photograph beginning to flake away from its backing. He still hadn't been served. The waitress walked right by him. At the next table, a group of people in peasant costumes and elegant masks were playing a fortune-telling game with cups of water, potato chips, and dirt. A beautiful blonde wearing a silk blindfold was feeling the outside of each cup, trying to decide in which one to put her fingers. There was a flower pot behind them. I suppose that's where they'd gotten the dirt. One of the waitresses glanced at them, frowning. "Greg, I know you're upset." I looked at her. "I'm sorry, but that was him. Or what's left of him. He's waiting." "What's he waiting for, Greg?" "I don't know. But I think it's me." I looked away, trying to look at the ocean, the waves breaking, then looked back at the room and saw the grin, the wide, glowing grin, one tooth missing. Alex was sitting where the clown had been. I leapt out of my chair and stumbled past the drunken, costumed figures at their tables. I reached for the grin, tripped, and crashed into the fortune-telling party. I looked down at my hand and the cup of dirt. When I looked at the table where the clown had been, a huge jack-o'-lantern sat there, almost covering the small tabletop, a candle behind the enormous grin flickering, creating shadows. I grabbed the waitress who had come to help me. "The man who was there, at that table, the clown mask," I gasped. She looked at me nervously and pulled away. "No one's sat here tonight. This is my station, the pumpkin, you know. We put the pumpkin on that table." Marcy got me out to the car, holding me up when I stumbled. Several people grinned at us, thinking I was drunk, I suppose. I kept turning back to the restaurant, the dark line of ocean, looking. And just before Marcy shoved me into the passenger seat, I saw the clown again, standing on the cliff beside the restaurant and taking off his mask and revealing another mask, a white glistening face beneath it. Marcy was quiet for most of the drive back into town. Then she glanced over at my dirt-encrusted hand. "You got pretty dirty there. What were they doing with those cups anyway?" "Fortune-telling," I said, staring at the road, waiting for something, anything to cross the path of the speeding car. I had the unnerving sensation of shadows in my peripheral vision. "You normally use dishes. One of water, one of meal. They used potato chips, and one of dirt. The one you put your fingers in reveals your destiny. And dirt? What is that supposed to mean?" "Death," I said. Marcy and I lived on Irving Street down by Golden Gate Park. A small apartment, but I loved the location. I jogged every morning in the park and took walks through the gardens. When she pulled into the curb, I reached over and covered her hand with the keys in it. "I want to drive around the park," I said quietly, "just a few minutes before bed." She looked at me. There were tears in her eyes. "You scare me, Greg." "I'm okay, really." I leaned over and kissed her. "I just need to be by myself a little bit, okay? Really, I'm fine." She waited on the street until I'd pulled around the corner. I drove down Lincoln and parked near a Mohawk station on 9th. Then I got out and walked. I'm always struck by the defensive nature of San Francisco architecture, particularly at night. Security garage doors, bars on the windows, and a flight of steps leading up to the heavy entrance door. Bay windows on each side. I passed house after house like that, long rows of them. like well-mannered old people on armored stilts afraid of being bitten. Golden Gate Park is not a good place to be at night. It's pitch dark, and if you hear a movement in the undergrowth, you can never be sure if it's an animal or somebody ready to deprive you of your money or life. I knew my brother had lived there, in the park, for 3 months one time, wandering around at night, sometimes leaping out in front of cars driving on Lincoln or on one of the other bordering streets. He'd said it was one of his favorite places. I thought of it as his favorite haunt. I entered the park at 9th and walked past the flower gardens, then I turned toward the Science Museum. A hill rose on my right, shrouded in trees and undergrowth, like a Neolithic burial mound, I thought. And I wouldn't have been surprised if some small, misshapen fairies had climbed down out of the trees and carried me off. I stopped at the giant bust of Beethoven. I looked up. I couldn't make out most of his features in the dark, but I could see that he was grinning. When I turned and looked behind me, there was a fire in Tiffany Square. It became clearer as I crossed the street and headed down the steps leading into the square. Someone had piled up leaves and wood and built a bonfire. I walked around it. There was no one there. There was a few wooden chairs burning, charring to ash, and what looked like an upside-down cross. Or maybe it was just a broken piece of wood. Pumpkins were scattered around the fire, as if they'd been dropped in flight, their grins cracked or shattered. At midnight, all the pumpkins leave their vines and dance merrily across the field. It was from an old story or a song I couldn't remember. I thought about the pumpkin farms at Half Moon Bay and wondered what surprises might be happening there that night. Hey, brother. I thought I heard it, but perhaps it was the fire chasing the leaves with slow explosions. There was a basket or a wicker cage lying among some of the pumpkins, something black inside, something burned. I crouched low and held my hand over my mouth. Hey, brother. It was a black cat. Had been a cat. Raw red skin where the fur had burned away, eyes like red jelly. Hey, brother. I ran out of the park. The wind had picked up. A dog or something scurried out of my way. The city lights made a milky nimbus over the treetops. I don't remember starting the car. I was already on Union, miles away before I realized what I was doing. Then I saw the orange glow in the rearview mirror, the jack-o'-lantern grinning through my back window. I could feel the heat of my brother's eyes in the glowing holes. I shot up the first steep turnoff, the engine straining, whining in my ears. Crazy. As if I could outrun the apparition, but every time I looked into the rearview mirror, it was still there, its grin burning brighter each time I looked. My hands were wet, even in the cold air of the car, and I felt the slightest pull, left sometimes, then right, as if something were fighting for possession of my hands on the wheel. Dropping down Lombard Street, I sweated out each torturous bend, wondering what could have possessed me to go onto that street, the crookedest street in America, a street only the curious tourists would drive, faster and faster until the bumpers were scraping the low wall separating that serpent of a street from the flower beds planted in the loops. Something jerked the wheel out of my hands, and I screamed as the car slalomed down several more streets, and I began to fall asleep, losing my grip on the steering wheel, hearing my brother whispering to me news of his latest trick. I woke up in the Castro, near where my brother was murdered. The pumpkin was gone from the back window. The car wouldn't start, dead. I'd have to get out and walk. I started checking out bars. I don't know why. Maybe looking for a grinning face with bright red hair, maybe a guy in a clown mask. I wasn't stared at when I entered those places, much to my surprise, as if they'd seen me before, as if I were a regular, as if I belonged there. A leather shoulder turning, an eye deepened with blue mascara, a little rear-end cleavage, hips sliding away to let me into the bar, a rattle of chrome-plated chains. Things were different down in the Castro, Polk Street, this Halloween. The punk kids roving the streets in previous years had driven Halloween quietly indoors. And Ernie of Cliff's variety store had died, ending the annual costume contest on the huge stage in front of the store. The cops had little to do. They'd find more rowdiness among the jet set at the Cinderella Ball at the Mark Hopkins Hotel. I found the place thought I'd found the place where Alex was murdered. I wasn't sure. At the time, I hadn't come down to the site. I identified his body at the morgue. It had been his body, hadn't it? You aren't playing with me now, Alex, are you? I whispered into the wet gray mouth of the alley. I could hear rats scurrying inside, the glimpses of something far back in the alley, occasionally catching the streetlight. Fur, claws, a wolf mask, a raven's head. Alex? I heard a bell, low and full, mournful. A soul cake, have mercy on all Christian souls for a soul cake. The crier stepped out of the dark alley ringing his bell. He was dressed in blacks, suit black, lamp black, dark black of the soul. I giggled nervously. He had the clown mask on. Alex? Hey, brother. He walked up the street. I followed him. He pulled a piece of bread out of his dark costume and began to munch on it. A picnic in the cemetery, brother. He passed through a band of shadow, and I heard bells tinkling. He turned in a jester's costume now. White face, black grinning lips. A soul can be helped through purgatory, brother. He went down another alley, and I followed. He turned into a doorway, stepping soundlessly through the trash, and I followed. It was a small room, dark. The figure sitting on the edge of the bed turned its face toward me, and the halo of city fire outside the window caught the pale, flat cheekbones, the bright red hair. He held out his arms as if to embrace me. Another trick, Alex? But the figure on the bed stared at me sadly. He wasn't grinning now. There was such loss in those dull eyes. My heart went out to my brother, my aimless, wandering brother, alone even in death. I let my heart go out to him, let myself love him at that moment. I didn't know. He was still doing it to me. And suddenly, it was me on the bed, and my brother in my body, my disguise, standing in the doorway, grinning his grin. His laughter was drawn out, almost animal-like, as he turned and walked away. I couldn't move. I was frozen to the bed, fixed in shadow, and as night turned to day, and the day ticked off into evening, shadows again. A cool edge coming into the air, a silver edge to the black clouds and a blacker sky. I realized I was approaching the midnight of November the 1st, Lord Samhain's night. I felt increasingly insubstantial. Although when I looked at my reflection in the window, I could still see a face, my brother's face, and the feral look it had always had. The elongated jaw, wolf-like, fox-red hair, the grin that would not go away no matter how hard I tried. My brother was always the clever one, and I always envied him. I could sense it coming, the great harvest. I was scared, but could not leave the room. Now, the black sky and that silver line. Now I can hear the swish of his great scythe. Trickster by Steve Rasnic Tem.
Trick or treat, trick or treat. When you hear the doorbell ring, ding, 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 ding. Trick or treat, trick or treat. Lots of candy, gee, it's dandy. Trick or treat. Painting up your cheeks and nose, dressing up in funny clothes. Lots of candy, gee, it's dandy. Trick or treat. Dum dum dum, dum dum
dum dum. Cinderella, Peter Pan, walking with a monster man. Dum dum dum, dum dum dum. Lots of candy, gee, it's dandy. Trick or treat. La la la, la la la. Goblins, witches, all about. Get you if you don't watch out. La la la, la la la. Lots of candy, gee, it's dandy. Trick or treat.